Welcome to the Shameless Podcast, where I help Christian men kill shame, stand strong, and live on mission. I'm your host, Ken Freire, and I'm bringing you real stories, practical insights, and biblical truths that equip you to break free from your sin, shame, and live a life of purpose. Let's step out of the shadows together and into the light of Christ. All right, everybody, welcome back to another fantastic episode. Today, we're going to have a slightly different conversation. A lot of our conversations are geared towards you, right, finding the help. But for many of you who are listening, you're dads, right, and you have kids, and you've always wondered, how do you help your kids, right, with the issue of pornography, or how do you help them prevent even falling into that trap? So that's what we're actually going to talk about, helping kids, your kids specifically, overcome pornography. And today I have Jason Weening here. He is a dad of 10 kids and a husband of just one wife. He speaks and writes to encourage men to be intentional in their most important organization, not their company, but their family. And he is the host of the Helping Men Thrive podcast. Jason, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you, Ken. I'm glad to be here. I love what you're doing. It's so important. So love it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Jason, before we jump into it, I know that people heard the intro and they heard 10 kids. How in the world do you pull that off? Right? I'm over here with 4, like, Lord Jesus, come now.
Yes, Ken, I get asked that question a lot. And I have a great wife, and you do it one at a time, except when you have twins, then it's 2 at a time. So we have 8-year-old twin girls. But really, yeah, it's one at a time, and you learn as you go. And it is an organization to some degree. At some point, well, you've got 4 kids, so you're outnumbered 2-1. So you get a little bit. I kind of think once you're at 3, you're outnumbered, and 3, 4, 5, 10, you're outnumbered. So you just got to do the best that you can, and hopefully empower the ones at the top of the list to leverage your influence through the rest of them. You know, the influence of older kids to young. That's a whole other topic on itself. But
Oh,
yes.
100%. You know, my wife constantly reminds me, in a good way, of like how if we train the older 2 right, it's like a ripple effect for all of the younger ones. And I was like, we're just now starting to learn how to become good parents. If someone would have taught us, like, how do we train the first 2 to be really good? And obviously that's the work of the Holy Spirit too, but you know, there's stuff that we could do. Man, we would have been in such a better shape. So we're learning, we're on the go parenting. And I think that's right. By the time you get to your 10th, I'm sure you're like, we got this in the bag. This is easy.
Well, I say to my oldest kids, like my oldest she'll be 19 next week. And I say, hey, I'm going to make mistakes. I've never had a 19-year-old, but in 19 years, I won't be able to use that line anymore on my baby who's 6 months right now, because I will have had 9 19-year-olds. So I should know by then what it's like to have a 19-year-old.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you many times after this. Like, how do I do this? But Jason, you know, as we jump into our conversation, first, I'm curious, what led you to talk about intentional fatherhood, and especially helping men, you know, to talk about this issue of pornography with their kids? Because quite frankly, not a lot of people talk about it. And sometimes fathers think that intentional fatherhood is just financial provision, right? So what made you decide to, like, let's go in and talk about this?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of facets to the areas that we can influence our children, that's for sure. But one of the authors I read, I think it was maybe Barrett Johnson, said sexuality is the greatest battlefield of our time, and the battlefield is littered with casualties. And if we look around us at the marriages of our friends, that's what kind of spurred me to start the podcast, was just talking about friends whose marriages were falling apart. And these were good Christian guys in small groups in our church, doing well in business, but at home things were not going so. But really, the heart of it started with a mutual friend of ours, Heath Stoner, 25 years ago now. It's hard to believe that.
Yeah.
But Heath ran a program called the Trailer Club, and it was about he was helping young guys learn how to be better husbands and better fathers before we became husbands and fathers. And his slogan or his motto that was for the Trailer Club was, "What one man can do, another man can do." And the theory behind that is, if you know a dad who is a great father, or you know an older man who's a grandfather who has children that have grown up to become adults and grandchildren, guys that have won near the end of their lives, well, what one man can do, another man can do. If he could do it well, young guys like us, we could learn to do it well too, by asking them questions, by learning, by reading, by having discussions with other men. So really, it was in 2000, 2001, in that neighborhood where I think God really put a seed in my heart before I was married, before I was a father, to kind of start preparing for the future. I have a great dad. This for me, it didn't come from like a father wound kind of a place. My dad is awesome. I love him. We have a great relationship. But really, just seeing the need around us, seeing the need in my own friends' lives,
Yeah.
dads, you matter. What you do matters. You've got so much influence on your kids. Like, you got more influence than anyone else. And it's so important.
Hmm. And Jason, you just said something really important. Dads, you matter. Right? But many times dads don't feel like that, especially when it comes to this topic of helping their sons and their daughters talk about pornography and lust and this issue. Why do you feel like parents and specifically dads have a hard time sharing and talking about this topic?
Well, Ken, I've listened to some of your other interviews. Shame is the big topic that comes up when we start talking about pornography, start talking about this issue, start talking about masturbation, all this kind of stuff that is not, you don't have these sorts of conversations every day
Yeah.
at your coffee break while you're sitting at your softball game with the boys. You're not having these kinds of conversations by any means, because I think that shame is such a huge part of it. Make a difference in people's lives by shaming them into it. The story where they wanted to stone the lady, and he said, "Well, which one of you is without sin? Then you throw the first stone." And they all went away. And he looked at the lady and said, "Where are your accusers?" Jesus is not accusing us, but there is an accuser out there who does want to accuse us and does want to build up those walls of shame and keep us from engaging in this with our kids. So shame is a huge thing. I think also our own upbringing. I don't know about you, Ken, but I can think of one, but maybe two conversations with my dad about this kind of stuff. One was basic, like birds and the bees, and the other, I don't even know if there was another one. So have we had this modeled for us? I don't know if we have. I don't know many guys that have had this modeled for them. So part of it is shame, I think, and part of it is I don't know what to
Just
do.
a lack of training.
Yeah, I haven't been trained to do this. Heath used to say, how long do you train to become a plumber or a mechanic or a doctor or a lawyer? You could be doing apprenticeships. You could be doing 8 years, 10 years of schooling and stuff. Well, how many years did you go to school to learn how to be a dad or learn how to be a husband?
Yeah.
Anyone?
I remember when Heath used to say that to us, and I felt so convicted in a good way. Like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, we do all this training for everything, but we rarely do the training to be good husbands or good fathers. It's like, oh, maybe we read a book. Think about even like before you get married, premarital counseling. You're like, you do 6 sessions, and then it's like, then what? Right? It's just like, no, there's actually a lot of stuff that happens after you get married that, like, that's when you need it. I remember, and I don't know if you were there at the time when we were at the internship, John Bushnell. Does that name ring a bell to you?
I know John Bushnell. Yeah.
Yeah. So he actually did pre-engagement counseling with us, right? So
Wow. What a
yeah,
concept.
I know what a concept. Like, hey, before you even think about getting married, let's just sit down and talk and figure out between me and her, like, is this really the thing you guys want to do? I mean, it was like the most pivotal moment for me to be like, oh my gosh, I want to marry my wife. And then we did premarital counseling with him. And then we did post-marital counseling,
Hmm.
right? Like, there was all this training that we did with, him that like set us up to win, right? Like I know right now we're in a complete tangent. I'll bring it back in
I'm
a
writing
second.
it down. I'm like, I just wrote it down. My daughter's 19. I'm like, pre-engagement counseling. Well, I love
It,
it.
it was huge. I mean, he has a whole curriculum. So for all of you who are listening, John Bushnell, he's got a whole curriculum. It's awesome. But one of the things that I remember thinking is I remember people telling us, wow, the first year or first 2 years of marriage was so hard. And that was just not our case. And I don't want to be like, oh, I'm special. I think it's because we had the training that you were talking about, right? Like we had someone who came and trained us like 6 months before we got married. And then like 6 months after we were married, someone was there coaching us on how to deal with these conversations and built these muscles and habits for us, right? So it was a huge, huge victory in that regards. Now, going back to our conversation here about dads, right? Same thing about training dads. They don't feel like they know what to do in this conversation. So let's walk them through some practical tips on how do you help, okay, a father, right, who wants to help their kids, right? How do you help them gain some great practical tips on start working with their kids?
That's a great question, Ken. And I think we don't have to feel like we're an expert. To go back to the shame thing, sometimes we don't want to talk about this stuff because of our own past mistakes or our own current struggles.
Yeah.
And we feel like, I don't want to, I can't go through this with my kids because I haven't figured it all out yet either. Uh, Yoda said, didn't he say like do or do not do? There is no try or something like that. I think I'm botching the quote,
It's
but
okay. Disney botched Disney, the last three videos. So that's fine.
Dads, Yoda is wrong. He's wrong. Try. There is a try. Even if your heart is racing and your hands are sweating and you don't know what you're going to say to your last week, Ken, my 10-year-old son, we're driving in the van. Last week, he says, Dad, how do people, I kind of think I know, but how do people breed? Like, he says, I think I know, but I just want to ask you. And I felt my heart racing. And I've had the conversation with his four older siblings. So this is the fifth time I'm having the conversation. It did get a little bit easier, but we got to just have the conversation. And if you've, are you a professional baseball player, Ken?
No,
Did you
not
you
even
didn't
close.
play in the major leagues? I didn't see you in
No.
the. Okay.
I might have played for the Yankees, at
Yeah.
some point when I was 14,
Yeah, no doubt. You're the child prodigy.
Yeah.
But I bet you've probably like tossed the ball with your kids. You've
Yes.
had a catch with your kids. We don't have to be the pastors, the counselors, the therapists, the professionals. We can just be their dad and we can have a catch. We can just toss the ball with our kids. We can figure it out as we go. Just give it a shot. I think that's
Yeah.
that's where we got to go. Feel the fear and do it anyways.
Yeah. I remember before we recorded, actually, for those of you who are listening to this is the second time we had to record this because the first time, welcome to technology, botched it up. But the first time we talked about this, one of the steps that you talked about is creating a safe space for both yourself, right, to mess up, but then a safe space for your kids to be able to have these discussions. Walk us through, what does creating that kind of safe space look like?
So one of the authors that I read, it could have been in Barrett Johnson. Again, I mentioned him already in his book, The Talks. There's another book called Unwanted, and it's more about sexual healing. It came from one of those two sources, I think. But the author said we need to make pornography a casual term. And what he meant by that was that when we talk about, we've got to bring it up with our kids, even at a young age. A couple other good resources. There's a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. There's an older kids version and like a under 7 version. Very innocent, just paint a drawing, very like it doesn't show anything. Just great books to have the conversation. And I have read
Yeah.
this with my 8-year-olds, I'm going to say. And actually, we were reading it, and their 5-year-old brother came running out of his room and he's like, I heard you talking about pornography. And it's like, well, you didn't quite get it there, buddy. But we're bringing it up. We're talking about it. And you mentioned the term safe space, like giving our kids an opportunity to ask questions. And when they ask questions, don't shame them about it. Like curiosity And attraction and sexual attraction. Okay, two things. Curiosity, first of all, it's okay to be curious about things. And
Yeah.
we're curious about lions and tigers and crocodiles and things, but that doesn't mean we jump in the cage at the zoo with the lion and get into it. No, we watch safely from outside of the cage in a healthy environment. And that's like a family, a healthy environment with a mom and dad to talk about these issues that you're curious about. So I ask my boys when I tuck them in, I ask my boys and my girls, do you have any questions? At the end of the day, hey, do you have any questions for me about anything? And it doesn't have to be about pornography or things like that. But I did ask my son when he was asking me on Tuesday night about how humans breed. I
Yeah.
explained it to him and I said, any other questions you have, or have you seen anything you want to ask me about? Just creating it so that it's not talk about pornography. Bring it up in the home in a safe place so that it becomes part of your lifestyle to be bringing up topics like this. There's so many. I'll tell you another story. Same son, 10 years old, scrolling through. We have an iPad for the family. Scrolling through Spotify, sees something, some album cover, some pornographic album cover. And he goes right away to my wife and says, hey, Mom, I just want to tell you, I saw this thing. It wasn't good. I saw it on Spotify. It was like, great, no big deal. Thank you for coming to me. That's another thing, when they do come to us, praise them for it. Thank you. A lot of kids would be scared to talk to their mom and dad about something like this, but I'm glad you came to me. I'm always open to have these conversations with you, to answer your questions. If you tell me you saw something, hey, I'm on your side. I'm going to help you figure it out and work through this. No shame. No shame.
Yeah. There was another episode previous to this with Trevor Windsor, and he talks about being vulnerable. But he said he remembers a time he was trying to be vulnerable with his parents because it was the first time he heard someone, like a kid, say the F word,
Mm.
right? And he went back home and he asked his parents, like, well, what's the F word? And the way they managed it, he just remembered, like, it's not safe to bring this conversation up with my family. So anything to do with sexuality, he just kind of avoided. And that's exactly what you're saying. Like, I was actually listening to that and you're like, wow, you could have been like super helicopter parenting and be like, we're going to turn off Spotify. Can't believe you watched that. Why didn't you say something sooner? No, you were like, hey, I'm proud of you for coming to me. That's such a beautiful example of creating a safe space. And as you think about that, Jason, what happens on the flip side when you see that maybe one of your kids is struggling with pornography? What are some of the signs that are there that you can start to like be aware, like, oh, I need to be mindful that my kid may be falling into a trap and I need to now step in as dad?
I've heard a few people joke about this, like, is your son 10 years old? Does he have a cell phone? Those are your first two signs. He's probably seen pornography or looking at it. I had a conversation. I interviewed Dave Hawes, another mutual friend of ours,
Yeah.
for our podcast, and he said something along the same time, like, is your son 12 years old? Does he have a phone? Yeah, he's probably looking at pornography or has seen it, even if he's
Yeah.
not looking at it. So, what are the signs? That was your question. Secrecy. Proverbs says when we bring things out into the light, that's where freedom comes. And if our kids are starting to act in a way that is secretive, or they're trying to hide things, or you're observing things, they're super practical, like taking their phones into their rooms, or they have computers in their rooms. There's some practical things as parents we can do to prevent some of this from happening, like no phones or computers in the bedrooms could be one of those things. But watching, yeah, for secrecy, for hiding things, for acting in a different way, acting strange, quickly flicking away as soon as you approach when they're looking at their phone or something, or putting their phone down. Those are some kind of practical signs. And when you notice that, I think you just got to ask, like, hey, what were you looking at? Was there anything you saw that maybe you feel bad about seeing? How come you put your phone away so quickly? Just asking questions and getting answers from our kids, just keeping the conversation alive, constantly just keeping the conversation alive.
Yeah. One thing that's really important, Jason, and this is probably your demeanor, but I think that's really important, is it's not just the questions you ask, but also how you ask them. I think your tone, you bring a very curious, non-judgmental tone to it. Versus some people, if you're like, I'm a type A individual, I could be driving. This literally happened to me earlier today. I asked my wife a question and then I gave a response to the way she responded to my question. And she's like, dude, why are you so edgy? Like, what's wrong with you right now? And I'm like, sorry, I'm just on the go. I'm like, I was just moving and I didn't recognize that I was not a safe person at that moment. Right. And my wife knows me. She blew it off. But if my kids were doing something and I asked them the question that same way, I think a lot of walls would have come up. But what you did is very like, and maybe just because of this conversation, but from what I've known of you, you have that huge heart of compassion and like curiosity and non-judgmentalness that makes it easy. What are some other practical little tips that you can give to guys that will go a long way?
I think, and you go there all the time on this podcast, Ken, is just the transparency of your own life and telling them, like, my sons, guys, I've seen things that I knew I shouldn't have looked at as well. I'm not perfect. I'm trying to figure this out, and I need God's grace too. And as our kids transition to get older, I'm talking, my sons are 10 and 12 and 6. So we haven't got into any super intense discussions yet. My son turns 13 tomorrow. So I've got some ideas as we head into his 13th year of some very intentional discussions to have. But just letting them know that, hey, I'm not perfect either. I struggled when I was young, when I was your age. I understand. I'm a man too. I was at 13. I know what it's like to be 13 years old. I am not some perfect, I got all figured out. When I was a teenager, to go back to the shame thing, I remember being like, I was a good Christian kid at church and all this stuff, but still struggled with lust and masturbation and all this stuff. And I wrote a note to a friend of mine. We were both on the worship team at our church. I played drums, he played guitar, but I was too afraid to write it in my own handwriting. So I like cut out letters out of the newspaper, like a ransom note, so he couldn't figure out who it was. Cut out these letters, folded this up, put it in his guitar, in the back of his guitar amp after practice one day. And it was like, please pray for me. I need help. Super vague. But what I had in mind was like, I need help because I'm masturbating and I feel guilty about it. And I
Yeah.
hadn't had any kinds of discussions at that point. I'm like, I don't know, 14, 15, 16. I'm not sure, something in that neighborhood. Anyways, he didn't know till like 10 years later that I had written that note. And we were both married. I said, hey, do you remember in youth getting like the ransom note? He's like, I didn't think that was you. But the shame, that was the thing. The shame was just like, wanted to be anonymous, didn't want him to know about it. With our kids, shame is the enemy. We don't want our kids to feel afraid and shameful to come to us to talk about it. Ken, God has put us as dads in our kids' lives. There's no one else who could have been your kid's dad except for you.
Mm.
Now, I get it. There's adoption, there's fostering. So there are some exceptions to the rule. But God literally gave you your children. He could not have given them to anybody else. And I believe along with that came this mantle of leadership and influence as dads, even when we feel like we can't do it. And even when we feel like we have shame, and even like we are not perfect, nobody was perfect. Dads, you can do it. And God has given you that influence in your kids, even if you're not going to do it perfectly. That's okay.
Jason, that is such a encouragement, right? Even when you were just saying like, God gave you these kids, and I was even thinking about adoption, right? Like God allowed that to happen, that you would to be
Yes.
adopted, right? Like in His sovereignty, now you have those kids. Like God gave you these individuals, so there's a reason that He gave you these individuals. As you think about this topic, it can be really scary for a lot of parents. Like you were saying earlier, it's just unknown, and they don't know what to do. What are some good resources or recommendations that you have? You mentioned some already, but just remind them, and any others that you think would be helpful for guys to just be like, I really need this because I want to take proactive steps in helping my kids and prevent them from actually ever falling into the trap.
That is a great question. And like I said before, if we can get help from other people. And I found some of these resources to be helpful because you can sit and read this book, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. It's like it's not a Dr. Seuss book, but it's a kid's book. it's innocent. You can read there and you can get the discussion started. So I like it that it kind of takes, I feel like it takes the pressure off of you as a parent to have all the answers and explain all the things. It is just an intro to get started. So good pictures, bad pictures. If you Google it, you'll find it. Kristen, I have it here beside me. Kristen Jensen is the author. Good pictures, bad pictures. So that is a fantastic resource. Another super simple one is called Who Made Me? And this is a book. My mom read it to me when I was in grade 4, probably. Who Made Me? And it's just another simple kids book that explains the birds and the bees and what sex is and all this kind of stuff in a real simple, kid-friendly way to go through that. So those are kind of for kids that are younger, I'm going to say. They're kind of picture books. The Talks is another book by Barrett Johnson. I've already mentioned him. And the title of the book says it all, Ken. Like, we sometimes hear, oh, have you had the talk with your kids, or how to have the talk with your kids? Well, that's the whole completely wrong premise. It's not the talk. It's talks over years. It's talks over coffee. It's talks when you're in the car. It's talks over meals. Kind of a practical tip. I find it easier, and I think a lot of dads probably could relate to this, to talk while you're walking. My son asked me, what was the F word? This was last February. So we're filming this in November. So it was 10 months ago. My son asked me, what's the F word? Like that example you just gave. And we just went for a walk, and I explained, what the F word meant to him. And walking along beside him, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, or maybe while working on, if you're working out in the garage or doing some woodworking or throwing the ball, or maybe you're playing video games together, doing something where you're shoulder to shoulder with your kids.
Yeah.
I find that a lot easier. I think dads do. Some people say women like talking face to face better, and guys like talking like shoulder to shoulder better. I can certainly relate to that. So talking shoulder to shoulder, doing that. And yeah, using other resources there. There's so many resources out there, and you don't
Yeah.
have to have all the answers.
Yeah. 100%. There's two resources that I'll actually mention. One, and this is more in the sexual abuse area, but this is something it happened to me. It was personal to me. There's a book by Justin Holcomb called God Made You. And it was all about how protecting yourself. So like, that's a great recommendation in this kind of conversation of like pornography and sexuality for kids. I read that regularly to my kids and remind them, especially as they're getting older and have other friends that are influencing them. I know I was at a birthday party the other day, and I saw my daughter hanging out with one boy, and she's like, "Oh yeah, he's a really good friend of mine." And I'm like, "Oh yeah." And they're 7. I mean, it's like, but I could just tell, right? Like I could just tell there was something, the chemistry there. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to remind her how to like protect her and just like protect her body so that someone's just not like, oh, we're playing a game or we're being curious. Right. So
Yes.
book. And the second book, this is going to sound, I don't know what the right word is, like cliche, but the Bible. And here's what I mean by this. We go through devotionals every morning. I read the Bible, right? We're going through stuff. And as you're reading the Bible and you're reading books of the Bible to them, they're going to talk about sexual morality. They're going to talk about topics where that's where you can make it normal for them to like, oh, what's sexual morality? What's this? And having those conversations be a part of everyday life is super helpful, right? And there are times, man, when I'm reading the Bible, I'm like, gosh, I hope they do not ask me a question. Right? Like it happens. And then there are other times that I'm like, I was not expecting that question. I really wish that they would have asked me the question on sexuality better. Like it was just curveballs. But it's
Yes.
super beneficial.
One of my kids was reading, it was like Leviticus or something like the laws about sexual immorality. And
Yeah.
I forget what the term was, but it was some term he didn't understand. And it was from reading like Leviticus. You couldn't pick a more boring book of the Bible to read. And the sex questions come out of Leviticus. But Proverbs, 100%. Reading Proverbs with my kids. One of the questions, Dad, what is a seductress? We're reading our Bible, Proverbs 4 or Proverbs 7, I can't remember. The term seductress comes out, and the boys ask, Dad, what is a seductress? And the book of Proverbs, Ken, to talk about the influence of moms and dads, like it is a whole book of a dad giving advice to his son. And he talks about your mother and I, and when you sit on your mother's knee, and there's a whole chapter at the end of it about a godly woman. Like it is all about family and the influence of mom and dad. So yes, The Bible is full of great examples, good and bad, of sexuality, and it brings it up and normalizes it, like you just said.
Yeah. I love it, Jason. As we wrap up our conversation here, what's some final piece of advice or encouragement you want to give to these guys who are just starting off in this conversation with their kids? And they might even feel a little shame of just bringing it up. They're just like, I don't know what to do.
We've all made mistakes. Anyone in the room here who's perfect? No. There was one guy who was perfect. It wasn't Ken. It certainly wasn't Jason. So the pressure we sometimes put on ourselves that we need to have it all together and have it all figured out before we can talk to our kids, just get rid of that pressure. Give it a try, feel the fear, and do it anyways. I had a quote out of my full focus planner, Ken, so you'll appreciate this. And the quote was, to begin, begin. Just give it a shot. Get out there and do it. And, don't feel like you've got to have it all together. It's okay. And if you come across your son looking at something, don't freak out. Kind of recapping some of that stuff. Be calm. Talk about it. None of us is perfect. Just make that normalization of the conversation happen. Feel the fear and do it anyways.
Yeah, I love it. And then you're absolutely right. Feel the fear and do it anyways. Like just begin.
It's a real thing.
Yeah. I know I felt it. I feel afraid sometimes I have like other conversations, but I'm like, you know what? I got to do this. Like, that's what I'm here for. As a father, is to step up and to have those hard conversations. But if I don't have them, the social media is going to do it. The culture is going to do it. Their friends are going to do it. So for those of you who are listening and are fathers, like you want in this age, right? Like, and Jason, I think you would agree with me. Your kids are so impressionable at such a young age. And you have the most influence in this time span, right? When they're like 4 to 12, right? Like they're like probably like going to listen to you the most. That's when you want to be able to be speaking wisdom into their life. So Jason, thank you so much for all of the wisdom, everything that you have talked about. For those people who are like, man, I want to help lead my family well. I want to help become an intentional leader in the household and father, like you were talking about. What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is heydads.ca. That's Canadian. That's where the .ca comes from. Heydads.ca. It's got links to all of my podcast and YouTube channel. I also wrote a fiction book for like 8 to 12-year-olds. I had boys in mind when I wrote it. It's about adventure and like Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park, Hardy Boys. That was the vibe I was going for, of boys going on adventures, not alone, but with older men, with their fathers, and learning from older men in that scenario. But heydads.ca is the best place to find all of my propaganda.
I love it. And what's the name of the book?
The book is called Danger in the Jungle. It's available on
Yes.
Amazon. Danger in the Jungle.
I love it. Jason, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And for those of you, again, who are listening, go check out heydads.ca and Dangers in the Jungle. We'll also put that in the podcast show notes so that you guys could have it and find it easily. Jason, thank you so much again for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for everything you're doing.
Yeah. Men, as always, kill shame, stand strong, and be on mission. Hope you have a great day, and God bless. Thanks for joining us today. If you found this episode helpful, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. Remember, killing shame isn't just about breaking free from the past. It's about walking boldly into the future God has for you.